Welcome, folks, to the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center Summer Climate Academy webinar on Addressing Managed Retreat. My name is Marjorie Kaplan. I'm the Associate Director of Rutgers Climate Institute. Matt, I'm just going to do an audio check. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Marjorie.
Okay, and I think my bandwidth is a little wonky, so my camera isn't showing up. I apologize for that. But I'm the Associate Director of Rutgers Climate Institute, and along with my colleague, Jean Herb of the Edward Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, I co-direct the newly established New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center. Other than today's presenters, Katie Spidalieri and Annie Bennett from Georgetown Climate Center, and our team here at Rutgers, you are all muted. So to communicate with us, please type your questions into the chat box. To find the chat box, you would hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen. A series of circles will be displayed. There is one circle that looks like a dialog bubble, and if you click that, the chat box will come up, and you can type your questions there. You're welcome to type your questions into the chat box throughout today's presentation. Please type into the All Panelists button. We are monitoring the questions as they come in, and after the formal presentation, we'll address as many of them as time allows. We will be recording today's webinar and alert you to its availability. For those of you who were not on any of our previous webinars, I'd like to give you a quick overview about the newly formed New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, which is housed at Rutgers. It was created by legislation that was signed by Governor Murphy this past January to create and support the use of impartial and actionable science to advance government, public, private, and non-governmental sector efforts to adapt to and mitigate a changing climate. And it's intended to conduct applied research, create planning tools, develop technical guidance, undertake pilot projects, and provide practical support for addressing climate change in the state of New Jersey. Also, as part of its mission, the center is to connect actionable research to policymakers, planners, practitioners, the media, communities, students, and other individuals through outreach, training, and education. So in keeping with that particular mission, we are very pleased to present today's webinar by Katie Spidalieri and Annie Bennett from the Georgetown Climate Center. Katie's a senior associate at Georgetown Climate Center. Her work focuses on adaptation in the coastal sector, including evaluating land use and other tools and strategies, such as managed retreat, to adapt to rising seas and flooding. Prior to joining Georgetown, Katie worked for NOAA and state environmental agencies in Maryland and North Carolina. She holds a JD from Cleveland Marshall College of Law and the University of Virginia, where she received 2 degrees with distinction in history and an interdisciplinary environmental thought and practice program. She's currently pursuing a master's of law in environmental and energy law at Georgetown University Law Center. And joining Katie is Annie Bennett, who's also a senior associate at the Georgetown Climate Center. Annie's work is focused on state and local adaptation policy, adaptation and resilience in the transportation sector, and cross-jurisdictional governance issues. Annie received her JD from Georgetown Law in 2013. And during law school, she participated in the Harrison Institute for Public Law's Policy Clinic, working on legal and policy questions related to urban heat adaptation. She also interned at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Environment and Natural Resources Division, working on Fifth Amendment takings cases. Annie holds a BA in Chemistry and Neuroscience from Dartmouth College. And before I turn it over to Katie and Annie, just a quick reminder, put your questions in the chat and we will get as many as possible during Q&A. So with that, it's my pleasure to invite Katie Spidalieri and Annie Bennett to turn on their video and their audio and commence. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Rutgers and the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center and Marjorie and Carrie for hosting Annie and I today to talk a little bit about Managed Retreat and our newest, one of our newest online resources, the Managed Retreat Toolkit. Before we get started, I'm going to share my screen so you all can see some lovely slides to accompany our presentation. Let's see. Marjorie and all, can you all see the slides and is sound working well?
Sounds great. You can see it.
Okay, perfect. All right, thanks so much. And so before we get started, I wanted to provide everyone with a brief introduction to the Georgetown Climate Center. If you're not familiar with us, we're a nonprofit associated with Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. We've been around for over 10 years, and we serve as a climate law and policy resource for states and communities, both in the space of mitigation, so reducing emissions from the transportation and energy sectors, but also on the team that Annie and I are part of for adaptation to help states and communities prepare for the impacts they're facing from climate change. To do that, we serve a variety of roles, including functioning as a convener for policymakers and other groups. We track federal, state, and local adaptation policies, but we also provide a variety of different resources, including the one that we're going to talk about today. All right. So I am going to turn off my camera so that way you all can see the slides better as we go through, and then Annie and I will both turn on our cameras again during the discussion session. So. All right, so rising seas and increasingly frequent and intense weather events are leading many coastal communities to confront difficult questions about how best to protect people, development, infrastructure, and coastal ecosystems from climate change impacts. The voluntary movement and transition of communities and ecosystems away from vulnerable coastal areas is increasingly being considered as a strategy for climate adaptation, and that's what we're calling managed retreat. In the face of unchecked climate change, the alternative in many places would be unmanaged retreat, and the consequences across a variety of sectors can be devastating. The first comprehensive online resource on managed retreat, Georgetown Climate Center's new Managed Retreat Toolkit, combines legal and policy tools, best and emerging practices, and case studies to support peer learning and decision-making around managed retreat and climate adaptation. The purpose of the toolkit is not to say that managed retreat is or will always be the best or preferred adaptation strategy in a coastal jurisdiction, but we're really trying to fill an informational gap to bring more support for interdisciplinary and nuanced discussions around managed retreat, acknowledging that it will only be one part of the coastal adaptation solution set and likely leveraged with protection solutions, which are more traditional and you all may be more familiar with in regards to hard armoring solutions or levees, and also accommodation strategies that are put in place through elevating structures and infrastructure and floodproofing. So really all three of these will play a role going forward, but we're trying to draw more attention to managed retreat to support policymakers and communities on the ground that might be interested in pursuing it. Under the best of circumstances, we are putting forward the definition for managed retreat, that it's really the coordinated process of voluntarily and equitably relocating people, structures, and infrastructure away from vulnerable coastal areas, and also facilitating transitions for people, communities, and ecosystems to higher ground or areas further inland that are less at risk. In practice, however, managed retreat is an inherently complex and challenging subject for state and local governments. Everything in this toolkit is intended to make it easier for decision makers and the communities they serve to have those hard conversations and plan together for the benefit of all. The primary audiences for the toolkit are state and local policymakers in coastal jurisdictions. Today, Annie and I are going to walk you all through the toolkit at a high level and take a deeper dive into a few parts. As you can imagine, we can't unfortunately cover the entire resource in just 1 hour, but during the discussion portion, please feel free to use the chat box throughout today's session to ask us questions that may come up, whether we go over it or not, and we're also happy to serve as a resource for you after today's presentation. And I wanted to say, too, that a lot of the discussion that we're going to have and the case studies that we're going to share are focused on New Jersey or Northeastern examples where relevant, because they might have more of a peer learning or lessons learned translation for this audience. But we're happy to also sort of expand the conversation if you have questions about what might be occurring elsewhere across the country. So what's in the Managed Retreat Toolkit? The toolkit contains 8 sections that present different legal and policy tools state and local coastal governments can evaluate to potentially implement broader managed retreat strategies. Section 1 is an introduction that tells users how the toolkit can be used and how it's organized. The introduction also includes an acknowledgement section that lists the literally dozens of policymakers, experts, and community stakeholders who inform this effort. So this toolkit was developed for practitioners, with practitioners, and other experts to really be useful on the ground. And I'm grateful to the many policymakers and stakeholders in New Jersey who really informed this effort. The other 7 sections of the toolkit fall into 2 categories. So the first is we contain 5 what we call tool sections that identify the legal approaches that jurisdictions can consider adapting to meet local context and needs around managed retreat. These include the 5 tools you see on the screen for planning, infrastructure, acquisition, regulatory, and market-based tools. State and local governments can apply each tool individually or think about advancing a potential suite of tools as something more broader and not just focused on one individual tool. The toolkit also contains 2 what we call cross-cutting sections on legal and policy considerations, respectively. These sections present a deeper dive look into legal and policy questions and issues that are raised across all or most tools. For example, one notable cross-cutting legal question is how governments can minimize the potential legal risk associated with regulatory takings of private property under 5th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and state analogs. Similarly, cross-cutting policy issues that we present in the toolkit include how to fund managed retreat strategies, facilitate wetland migration inland, engage communities, and plan for and make investments in receiving areas where people may voluntarily choose to relocate after they move away from the coast. So from here, Annie and I are going to walk through each of these sections, and as I mentioned, discuss some different case studies of examples and where applicable from New Jersey and the Northeast. With that, we're going to kick things off with planning. In the planning section, we identified 9 different types of plans that can be used in a managed retreat context to achieve different and multiple purposes. Planning will be a critical component of managed retreat strategies for many reasons. These include how plans can serve as useful organizational and implementation tools, elevate and encourage proactive discussions about managed retreat, and this is really where planning comes in to help make decisions quote unquote managed versus quote unquote unmanaged. Plans can also support the phasing of actions over time and promote community participation and support. A diversity of plans can be used as a strategic and guiding mechanism to proactively evaluate and implement actions for managed retreat to maximize benefits and minimize costs for multiple stakeholders in the environment. Comprehensive managed retreat strategies will ideally consist of plans and a combination of infrastructure, acquisition, regulatory, and market-based tools. So the point here is that hopefully plans will be developed with potential implementation in mind versus just developing a plan that's going to sit on the shelf and sort of lack some type of implementation focus in the future. The issues associated with coastal zone management, which is, again, sort of the sector we're focusing on for managed retreat, should not be considered separate and apart from ongoing land use and infrastructure planning that are otherwise occurring at the state and local levels. These efforts might be out of cycle or just these issues need to be explicitly about managed retreat need to be explicitly incorporated into the regular cycle of legally mandated planning documents. There may, however, be an opportunity to pursue supplemental planning initiatives for discrete or areas or purposes. These efforts could be out of cycle or discretionary planning initiatives that explore solutions to challenges, such as specific intergovernmental coordination efforts or unique conditions associated with interjurisdictional challenges, such as looking at metropolitan scale coordination or ecological asset-based planning centered on watersheds or regional wetlands. All plans should be developed through highly participatory public processes that provide interested stakeholders with an opportunity to meaningfully engage and inform a plan's development. Governments should also coordinate across agencies and clearly link different plans that include elements of managed retreat. We're going to look at 2 examples of plans right now, the idea of a coastal management plan and hazard mitigation plans and how they can be used together. So Hawaii presents an example of how different types of plans can be used to advance managed retreat, increase interagency coordination, and work across coordinated planning documents. In 2019, Hawaii released what I would call the nation's first state-level plan that's really specifically focused on managed retreat. That's the Hawaii Feasibility Study on Managed Retreat. This plan or feasibility study was really put in place because the state had an interest in having its coastal program at the state level evaluate what a managed retreat policy or program could look like in Hawaii. To undertake this effort, the state engaged in a domestic and international literature review to learn from examples throughout the country and internationally on how others have approached managed retreat, and also engaged several stakeholders in the state to gather their thoughts on it, see what the issues are and potential paths forward. The feasibility study documents this process that they undertook, but also really comes to the conclusion that to say Hawaii will just put together a program or policy on managed retreat is really putting the cart before the horse. And so while the feasibility study itself does not recommend whether or not the state go forward with such a program or policy, it does recommend further study in this area and also potentially looking at opportunities to explore the issue, not just on something that would be specific to Hawaii, but acknowledge the different types of geographies and environmental considerations and development patterns throughout Hawaii that would really need a nuanced or specific understanding of managed retreat if the state were to go forward with something. So for example, the state recommends going forward with potentially funding small pilot projects in different areas to see what types of tools would work in one area compared to another. In Hawaii, the state hazard mitigation plan and also Honolulu's multi-hazard pre-disaster mitigation plan analyze climate change impacts as potential hazards that the governments respectively could address, and also identify managed retreat in this context as a special or potential hazard mitigation strategy, whether that's through buyouts or other techniques. So by including managed retreat in these plans, it will enable the state to better coordinate action, not just horizontally at the state and local level, but also vertically across the state's hazard mitigation office and also coastal program as well. As many of you may know, there are increasing opportunities for pre-disaster mitigation funding at the federal level, but to be able to get that funding, having a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan in place is a prerequisite to that. And so by including managed retreat as a potential hazard mitigation strategy in those plans, the state can potentially leverage additional opportunities for funding those types of programs and projects if and when this funding becomes available. And then they can also work with the coastal management program. And if there's coastal management opportunities for funding, they can work across the different agencies, vice versa. I am now going to turn over things to Annie, who is going to walk through our infrastructure section.
Hi, thanks, Katie. So I'm going to transition a bit. The infrastructure section of the toolkit deals primarily with considerations relating to publicly owned assets as opposed to structures or land under private ownership. And more specifically, this section of the toolkit currently focuses primarily on roads, although we hope to expand the section to other types of infrastructure in the future. There are 3 subsections of the infrastructure chapter. And in organizing this section of the toolkit this way, it emphasizes the importance of a phased approach and making these decisions in the broader context of other land use decisions. So the previous planning discussion and many of the types of plans included in that section of the toolkit are also relevant here. I'm going to go into a bit more detail of what is included in the asset relocation and realignment and the disinvestment strategies sections. I will say that these 2 sections don't, unfortunately, currently have case studies focused in New Jersey or the Northeast. If anyone is aware of any examples that would be good to include in these sections, we would definitely welcome those suggestions. And there are a few examples from New Jersey and New York in the design modifications and asset protection section, however, and I am happy to discuss those a bit if there's interest during the Q&A. Next slide, Katie, please. Thank you. So first, I think it's helpful to start out this conversation with a few overarching considerations that are relevant to infrastructure decisions in a managed retreat context. Coastal roads in many areas are experiencing worsening impacts from climate change and sea level rise, including more frequent tidal flooding, erosion, saltwater inundation, and storm surge, all of which can damage or affect the structural integrity of roads. Ultimately, this causes public safety concerns, creates traffic delays, and affects access to neighborhoods, goods, and services, and it strains local and state maintenance budgets significantly in some areas. In choosing an appropriate strategy to address these risks, infrastructure agencies will want to have an understanding of the specific risks to their coastal infrastructure and will need access to data and resources to help with applying this information. The toolkit identifies several good sources that are focused on applying this information in the transportation context, including data, tools, and engineering guidance from the Federal Highway Administration. And there's a new guidebook out on cost-benefit analysis of adaptation measures from the National Academy of Sciences. So relocating roads or even disinvesting altogether can provide long-term solutions to these challenges, but of course come with a number of practical, financial, and legal considerations, as well as concerns relating to the effects that they might have for communities and surrounding environments. These decisions are necessarily linked, and other land use considerations and conversations around managed retreat should occur together, considering implications for both public infrastructure and private property. In many cases, this requires collaboration between a lot of different agencies and at multiple levels of government, depending on the ownership or authority over assets and lands involved, and whatever other community or environmental considerations are at play. This all points to the importance of planning, as Katie discussed, and in the transportation context specifically, there are federal requirements that apply to states and regions receiving surface transportation funding, some of which are relevant in this context. So for example, state DOTs and MPOs must consider projects and strategies that improve the resiliency and reliability of the transportation system and reduce or mitigate stormwater impacts as part of their long-range transportation planning processes. State DOTs are also now required to develop risk-based asset management plans. And as part of this process, federal regulations specifically call for the inclusion of current and future environmental conditions, including extreme weather events and climate change, among the factors that could affect the life and performance of roads and bridges. So considerations of how different transportation assets are used and their criticality will be important aspects of considering risk-based management and how different solutions might need to be phased in a managed retreat context. In completing these planning processes, states should be informed by considerations of how the public and surrounding communities use the infrastructure and should engage communities in any decisions around managed retreat strategies relating to public infrastructure. Next slide, please. One option in the managed retreat context is to relocate or realign roads or sections of them, which in some cases might provide a longer term solution than adapting or protecting in place. As I mentioned, state DOTs are required to develop long-range plans that incorporate resilience and asset management plans that factor climate change into the analysis. Additionally, state DOTs are also required to conduct periodic evaluations of highways and facilities that have required repeated repair or reconstruction due to emergency events to determine whether there are feasible alternatives. And those evaluations must be considered when states develop their asset management plans and transportation projects. DOTs and MPOs are also encouraged to consider these evaluations in their long-range planning and in developing transportation improvement programs, which determine the projects to be funded over the next several years. These kinds of evaluation and planning requirements can help point out those opportunities for states to consider alternatives like relocation or even disinvestment strategies where roads are repeatedly at risk of damage or destruction from coastal impacts. And allowing for phased solutions by adopting an adaptive management approach with environmental thresholds can also help to ensure that there's enough time left to implement more permanent solutions like relocation or disinvestment when environmental conditions make it infeasible to adapt in place. Road relocation or realignment projects are generally large undertakings, of course, and require a lot of interagency collaboration. So these considerations are relevant, beyond the state DOTs that might be leading the effort. There is generally also a wide range of other economic, environmental, legal and administrative, and social and equity considerations. And as with any adaptation strategy, rigorous scientific data and climate projections and economic analysis can help inform these decisions. Next slide, please. This section of the toolkit features several case studies where different road realignment strategies have been or are being implemented with coordination of multiple agencies and other stakeholders. So these examples also highlight efforts to repurpose lands that served as the original road alignment to provide new or enhanced coastal habitat and recreational features as well. The Piedras Blancas realignment project in the San Luis Obispo, California area is one such example. This involved relocating a 2.8-mile section of iconic Highway 1, 475 feet inland, in order to protect the highway from coastal erosion and bluff retreat beyond the year 2100. This section of the highway was experiencing worsening storm damage, flooding, and erosion, with those impacts expected to further accelerate with sea level rise. And Caltrans determined that the preferred alternative was to realign the section of the road as opposed to bluff armoring, which would have had greater environmental impacts and was inconsistent with coastal commission policies calling for the protection of coastal resources and natural processes. When they were establishing the 100-year erosion line, Caltrans considered the accelerated rates due to climate change. In implementing this project, they preserved land to the west of the new alignment to restore coastal prairie, lagoons, and wetland habitat, and the former road alignment itself was used to expand the California Coastal Trail, which offers active transportation opportunities. Next slide, please. The final section of the infrastructure chapter deals with more formal disinvestment strategies. Disinvestment in general refers to consciously allowing the infrastructure to fall below accepted standards of condition or performance. In this context of managed retreat, we're using the term to refer to strategies that either phase out maintenance or affirmatively discontinue or abandon roads where coastal conditions are making their upkeep challenging or cost prohibitive. For some coastal areas, chronic underinvestment is already an issue, leading to poor infrastructure performance, traffic delays, and safety concerns. So a more deliberate disinvestment approach might offer a better strategy to reduce risk of harm, particularly if design or relocation approaches are not appropriate or feasible. However, there are, of course, significant legal and social considerations with these options as well. For example, the potential for takings claims if landowners affected by a road closure lose significant access to the road network. And authority may be a concern as well, where state and local agencies, in some cases, are limited in their authority to abandon assets, for example, and also states may set uniform minimum design and maintenance standards that can prevent or inhibit a phased out maintenance strategy at the local level. As with other strategies, the criticality of the road to the network and to users will be a big factor in these decisions. For roads that are heavily used or provide sole access to communities or critical services, those adaptive design, protection, or realignment strategies may be more feasible as solutions than disinvestment in that context. Regardless, engaging community members, businesses, emergency responders, and other stakeholders early on in the planning process is important as well if disinvestment is being considered as a strategy. And again, economic analysis of the different options can help make the case for disinvestment to the public, legislatures, and other stakeholders. Next slide, please. And then lastly, on the subject of infrastructure, I just wanted to highlight one case study that's included as an example. In St. Johns County, Florida, they passed an ordinance in 2012 providing for the modification of design criteria and standards in environmentally challenging locations. These are locations where typical road design standards are not feasible due to naturally occurring conditions such as repeated damage or where standard maintenance of the road might adversely affect a protected resource. The Florida Department of Transportation sets the minimum design standards for roads within the state, but allows for design exceptions where it's necessary to deviate from their design criteria. So the county ordinance creates a design exception from those minimum standards, which the county can utilize by passing a resolution that designates a specific road or section of road in order to trigger the design exception. So the ordinance is intended to help reduce county maintenance costs for upkeep of roads in these environmentally challenging areas, while also putting nearby landowners on notice that environmental conditions might affect their access and that they can expect non-standard road design and maintenance. At this point, I'll turn it over back to Katie, and I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards on the infrastructure portions of the toolkit.
That's it. Perfect. Thank you, Annie. So moving on from thinking about planning and ways to look at retreat for publicly owned infrastructure, the rest of the tools we're going to focus on really look at ways to voluntarily acquire or regulate privately owned property. So in the acquisition tools section of the toolkit, there are several different tools that we talk about. We're going to do a deeper dive into voluntarily hazard mitigation buyouts, but just quickly to provide some broader context, open space acquisitions will look at acquiring less developed or undeveloped land that has a high conservation focus. And conservation land trusts are nonprofit partners that can serve to help with voluntary buyouts or open space acquisitions. Land swaps are a way to exchange privately owned land for publicly owned land. For example, you could take publicly owned land in a less vulnerable non-coastal location and potentially switch title to property with homes in a coastal area that are vulnerable and are interested in finding a solution to move away from there. But they typically involve the exchange of title to land rather than actually exchanging any type of money. So where there is potentially like blighted properties or other land that a government has as an asset compared to available funds, this can serve as a managed retreat option. And leasebacks and life estates are basically tools that you wouldn't use on your own, but you would couple them likely with a voluntary buyout to increase participation in buyouts, where essentially the takeaway is it can allow people to stay on their homes longer who are interested in a buyout, but they wouldn't potentially have to leave the property until certain triggering events happened. Like, for example, if climate change impacts may not manifest for 10, 20 years, and it would be unsafe to live on a property at that point, one of these property arrangements could make it possible for people to move at that time and not before. So with hazard mitigation buyouts, they're probably the tool that's most closely associated with the concept of retreat. But as I hope you see today, this is an important tool, but it's not the only tool that can be used to facilitate retreat. Through buyouts, state and local governments purchase homes from willing sellers, demolish existing structures, and return properties to open space in perpetuity. Traditionally, buyouts have occurred in a post-disaster context in riverine locations. However, there's increasing interest and an increasing need to consider implementing buyouts in coastal areas before disasters strike and to address chronic threats like high tide flooding. The toolkit features several case studies and practice tips that recommend how policymakers can make buyouts more comprehensive by moving beyond property transfers and structural demolitions to looking for sustainable, non-disaster related funding sources, restoring bought out properties and conserving them as important community assets, and most importantly, engaging communities throughout the entirety of these processes and implementing strategies that can minimize the social and economic costs of buyouts, like by providing financial relocation assistance. Established in 1995, the New Jersey Blue Acres program is a nationally recognized example of a long-standing state-run buyout program. Blue Acres works closely with municipalities throughout the state to identify privately owned properties that are routinely threatened or flooded due to sea level rise and more frequent weather events. The program's experience with buyouts positioned the state to respond quickly to purchase properties from willing sellers in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. The program works directly with local governments to prioritize comprehensive buyouts of affected neighborhoods and restores and protects the properties to maximize the flood and cost reduction benefits for communities and the environment. To accomplish effective state-local coordination, the program has a diversified staff that meets local needs, including caseworkers, and a dedicated financial team that negotiates with banks and other financial lenders on behalf of homeowners. In 2019, the state approved a new sustainable funding source by allocating a portion of the state's corporate business tax for buyouts and other types of land acquisitions and land management purposes. Through this new funding source, the program will be able to have a greater impact in communities interested in pursuing buyouts outside of a post-disaster context, when it tends to be that is when federal disaster recovery funds flow. But as we know, climate impacts occur outside of those types of contexts. So how can buyouts be used to support people who are interested in that outside of a disaster recovery context? Another section of the toolkit explores regulatory tools that can be used to facilitate retreat. Living shorelines can be used as an alternative to hard shoreline stabilization measures like seawalls to really do two things. One, to enable people to potentially stay in their homes longer by protecting the shoreline and allowing it to maintain its natural connections with estuaries or bays or the ocean. But it can also help facilitate the inland migration of wetlands, so that way they don't come up against developed barriers that would prevent that migration. Setbacks and buffers serve sort of a similar open space conservation and preservation purpose. Development permit conditions would come into play with how private development could be regulated, for example, through coastal management programs or local land use and zoning permits, and include a myriad of things. For example, the one we focus on in the toolkit is looking at when structures potentially may have to be removed through development or redevelopment permits if and when certain triggers happen, like sea level rise or beach width comes to a certain point that it's no longer feasible for that structure to stay in place. And now we're going to do a deeper dive into thinking about zoning and overlay zones. Local governments have the primary authority to regulate land uses in their communities through zoning ordinances. Zoning ordinances provide the legal framework that governs the use and development of land in a municipality according to different districts based on the uses that are permitted there. Overlay zones or districts can impose additional regulations on top of that base overlay zoning. Zoning can be used to achieve a variety of purposes associated with managed retreat, such as phasing out development in vulnerable areas, or by prohibiting new development or redevelopment, or decreasing buildable density. Other purposes could include prohibiting hard shoreline armoring structures and promoting the use of living shorelines to facilitate the construction of natural shoreline protection measures, like we alluded to on the last slide. Or they could be used to protect inland habitat and species migration corridors and higher ground establishment areas that can support and sustain migrating habitats and species through natural resource conservation zones or overlays. By integrating zoning and long-term local comprehensive planning documents, which are usually mandated at the local level, local governments can look to establish clear expectations for investments that support managed retreat decisions, and also create durable legal frameworks that can minimize potential takings risk by putting property owners on advance notice of development restrictions. So keeping things home here in New Jersey, and I saw that Kelly Flick was also aware of this example and put some information about it in the chat box if people are interested. Woodbridge Township is working with the New Jersey Blue Acres program to combine buyouts with land use and zoning changes to implement a larger scale retreat for 200 homes. In 2016, Woodbridge's mayor and the city council rezoned its 120-acre buyout area from residential to open space conservation resiliency to prohibit new development and only allow for passive recreational amenities like trails and open space uses to preserve the floodplain. In addition, existing homes in this zone have to be elevated at least 1 foot above federal requirements set by FEMA when specified things happen. So really, homes in this zone must be elevated if any redevelopment or structural changes above ordinary maintenance are planned, in addition to if there are any property transfers or changes in occupancy or tenancy. By establishing this zone, the township aims to protect its bought-out area as natural flood buffers by encouraging people to sell their homes to the state instead of investing in expensive home elevations. Really, also, this zoning ordinance can also help to discourage private developers from quickly purchasing properties at a low cost after a disaster and then really rebuilding in vulnerable floodplains. So this is a great example of how local governments can layer or combine two different tools. So here you have buyouts and zoning and overlay zones. With the images on your screen, these are actually from Woodbridge in this sort of 120-acre buyout area. If you look to the image on your left, you will see sort of a discolored, I'm not sure if that's a power line or a telephone pole, but really the wood that's eroded at the bottom of this pole, that shows the height of the flooding that occurred during Hurricane Sandy when the nearby Woodbridge River overflowed. And on the right, this home was not covered by or elevated in response to the amended zoning overlay in Woodbridge, but just gives you an idea with all those cinder blocks how high homes would have to be elevated if it was triggered by the new overlay zone. So transitioning from regulatory tools, let's think about market-based tools for a minute. So these would be voluntary and not required by any type of regulation or mandatory. State and local governments can consider these types of tools to encourage people to move away from, protect, and relocate structures in areas on the coast that are identified for open space preservation or conservation. They can also be used to increase density in higher ground or inland urban or suburban areas. States, municipalities, and communities from across the country have expressed an interest in using these types of tools to facilitate managed retreat. However, we have not found many examples, and I think there are currently few of how they've been directly applied to implement managed retreat as a coastal adaptation strategy. There's likely several reasons for why these examples are rare, and we're going to discuss some of those in the context of a TDR program. So transfer of development right programs, many of which I know there are examples in New Jersey outside of a pure sea level rise managed retreat context. But really they create market incentives to shift development away from areas where it's discouraged, called sending areas, to areas where development would be preferred, called receiving areas. Under this type of program, landowners in a sending area, where you can see the example on your screen, can choose to sever and sell some or all of their unused development rights as TDR credits. In selling their credits, landowners agree to forego development and preserve their property through a conservation easement. TDR credits can then be bought and sold as a tradable commodity that's separate from the land itself. Separated TDR credits are typically sold to developers and receiving sites, and basically developers in these areas can purchase those TDR credits to increase the density of proposed development above base zoning standards in the receiving areas. In a managed retreat context, TDR programs could be used in two primary ways. First, governments could use these programs to transition or create disincentives for new development in vulnerable coastal sending areas by transferring TDR credits to increase density in more inland or higher ground receiving areas. Second, the sale of TDR credits could also encourage property owners with already developed lots to remove or relocate structures that could act as barriers to the inland migration of coastal habitats that are being inundated by rising seas. At present, as I mentioned, there are a few examples of TDR programs in the US that were or are being created for the explicit purpose of managed retreat. Some of these reasons could be one, there could be a question, particularly at the local level, if local governments can actually create a TDR program for the purpose of adapting to sea level rise. Some existing authorizations from state governments could definitely be broad enough to cover this, particularly because this would accomplish the same goal or objective as other TDR programs to conserve land or working lands in sending areas and to increase density or development in receiving areas. However, that may not be less clear in some states. It would depend on the specific authorization. Another reason that TDR programs might be rare in a sea level rise or managed retreat context is that to make these programs effective, you have to craft the right types of market incentives. And traditionally, with a TDR program, you're moving development out of a sending area that is less dense and probably has less expensive real estate, and transitioning those TDR credits to an area that is more dense and people want to increase development. And so private property and development might be higher and more expensive. This is almost the reverse in a coastal TDR situation because you have highly desirable coastal development that usually has a higher price tag, and you'd be sending those TDR credits to areas further inland that potentially have a lower price tag. And so it might be harder to structure those financial incentives. To address one of those considerations, in 2019, the state of New York passed Senate Bill with those fun numbers and letters on the screen, S624A, which essentially amended the state's enabling statute for TDR programs to allow local governments to create a TDR program to mitigate risks from sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. In this statute, the state explicitly includes language that allows local governments to create TDR programs to adapt to sea level rise and mitigate the hazards from that and flooding. By including this explicit language, New York can serve as an example of how states could potentially encourage other local governments to engage in these types of programs because they have that explicit authorization compared to if they didn't have that language, and it could potentially, they would wonder if they have the legal authority or not to do it and go forward. All right, rounding things out, we're off from the specific tool sections to looking at the cross-cutting legal and policy considerations in both of the toolkits. So with this, we don't have time, unfortunately, to dive into the cross-cutting legal section, but just a few points to note. In here, this chapter would ideally be read in concurrently with all the other tool sections because legal considerations will affect potential planning and implementation of any of these. Takings, so is one of the potential greatest concerns for policymakers, that they would be impinging on private property rights. But the takeaway from this section is really that while it's a concern that policymakers absolutely should consider, there are ways to mitigate potential legal risk and sort of account for that in developing climate adaptation and managed retreat solutions. So policymakers should be fully apprised of these ways to mitigate potential legal risk. In the cross-cutting policy consideration section, as I alluded to before, we talk about different federal, state, and local post-disaster and pre-disaster sources of funding that can be used to facilitate retreat, and also do a deeper dive into the issue of wetlands migration. But really quick, we're going to take a look at the important pieces of this chapter on community engagement and equity and receiving communities. While managed retreat tools and strategies will absolutely vary based on local context, one cross-cutting element is critical and clear. These decisions must be community-based, driven, and supported. It will be important for state and local governments everywhere to design and implement equitable community engagement and adaptation approaches. This will be particularly relevant for the development of laws and policies affecting frontline communities in both coastal and receiving areas. State and local governments can start engaging communities by equitably fostering discussions about managed retreat at the outset of climate adaptation and resilience discussions. While managed retreat will not always be the best or preferred adaptation strategy in every location, as we've gone over, governments should encourage proactive discussions about it to avoid potentially precluding the consideration and implementation of viable and less costly or disruptive adaptation alternatives. Before convening these discussions, however, governments must work with communities to build trust where it does not already exist. Additionally, governments can work with community members and community-based organizations, especially in economically and resource disadvantaged communities, to identify and provide them with tools and information that can allow basically them to actively engage in these discussions, and so that removes that barrier to their participation. And to support this, governments have to design and structure these processes in authentic and meaningful ways, so that way community engagement and participation is not just a checking the box exercise, and provide the funding and staff support so that way they can actually move forward and take place. Community engagement is, I mentioned, not just important in the sort of sending areas that would be beyond the concept of what we just talked about in the narrow context of a TDR area. These would be the vulnerable coastal areas where people may choose to relocate, but also this concept of receiving communities where people are thinking about going. This especially could come up in the context of buyouts. Receiving communities is a broader term that can be used to refer to locations where people may be relocating in response to coastal hazards and climate threats. Receiving areas can be located within a person's same municipality or a different municipal, county, state, or national jurisdiction. While the geographic characteristics and land use patterns of individual receiving communities will vary, they will ideally be located at a higher elevation and further inland away from vulnerable coastal threats. As a threshold matter, it may be difficult for policymakers to identify what is a true receiving area, based on factors like insufficient data on demographic and economic trends in many locations, and also trying to account for personal preferences about where people may move. Where policymakers can adequately identify receiving areas, they will necessitate proactive planning for and investments in affordable housing, supporting infrastructure, and critical services such as schools. These investments must be backed by sufficient funding. States and communities should work together to develop plans and create potential funding sources to support the development of receiving communities to facilitate better transitions for people and communities who choose to move away from the coast. So our final case study today really combines both of these concepts of community engagement and equity, and also receiving communities in a managed retreat context. LA Safe is another case study in the toolkit, and it's really a pioneering effort to address managed retreat in a state where rising sea levels and riverine flooding are already a clear and present danger. The state partnered with the nonprofit Foundation for Louisiana, communities, and a diverse set of stakeholders to implement LA Safe following Hurricane Isaac in 2012. To support disaster recovery efforts in coastal municipalities that are experiencing high rates of land loss and increasing flood risk. LA Safe is a planning and capital investment process designed to address these coastal impacts and other community needs like affordable housing in 6 coastal parishes. Through LA Safe, the state will help fund and implement 10 projects across the 6 parishes, including in higher ground, low flood risk receiving areas. The state and Foundation for Louisiana also worked with the parishes to develop 6 parish-specific and also 1 regional adaptation plan, which they call Adaptation Strategies. Over the course of a 9-month process, this public-private partnership between the state and Foundation for Louisiana convened over 3,000 participants in 71 meetings over 5 rounds of meetings. And these meetings were really designed in a way that could support community engagement and equitable participation. The program employed a variety of techniques, including 1, Foundation for Louisiana, before the commencement of the LA Safe process, trained community facilitators who were paid for their time and helped to facilitate these meetings. So they were led by people that community members knew and trusted, as opposed to outside individuals. The program organizers also worked to provide things like food and childcare to further enable participation, provided meeting materials in English and non-English speaking materials that could be translated for other people to participate, and a whole host of other things that really made this an exemplar in thinking about not just designing community engagement, equitable participation processes for managed retreat, but climate adaptation more broadly. Before we go, I just wanted to note that the case studies that Annie and I talked about today are included in more depth in the toolkit and also online at our Adaptation Clearinghouse, which is on adaptationclearinghouse.org. And we also did a deeper dive into 17 case studies, including LA Safe and the New Jersey Blancas program, and the buyouts that occurred in Woodbridge that can provide people with really more in-depth information on these case studies. Please feel free to take a look at those. And with that, I will hand things back over to Marjorie and Carrie for the question and discussion session.
Katie and Annie, you guys are remarkable, quite on time, but we have a very active number of questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carrie Ferraro, my colleague who's been monitoring the chat box, and I'm going to ask you if you guys can sort of do speed answers so we can get as many as possible, because there's been a very healthy number of questions going on. So go ahead, Carrie, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Marjorie, and a special thank you to you, Katie and Annie. As Marjorie mentioned, we have a ton of questions, so I tried to consolidate them as best that I could. Our first question is about infrastructure. Rob Graff asks, or he states, excuse me, that the Last Chance Grade project in Del Norte, California, is proposing to move a 3-mile portion of Highway 101 out of harm's way. Due to NEPA and I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with these, so CEQA requirements, the environmental review is expected to take 8 years. Can you talk about how such requirements might be streamlined to allow for easier managed retreat? Kind of a long question, sorry.
So yeah, I can attempt an answer at this one. NEPA review and state corollaries like CEQA come up a lot in the infrastructure conversations as a potential barrier to getting projects done. I think for really large projects like where you're talking about Highway 101 or Highway 1, to some amount of significant time that goes into these kinds of analyses is probably unavoidable because of all the engagement that has to go on and alternatives analysis and everything. One thing that came to mind was the opportunity for planning and environmental linkages, and to the extent possible, having agencies develop any relevant analyses during the planning processes that can later be incorporated into environmental review and be used to inform environmental review to cut down the amount of time that would be required to do those analyses. I don't know if Katie has any thoughts to add on that front.
The only quick thing I'll note is while there are opportunities to look at, amending NEPA and state analogs, we just need to balance those considerations for what would be helpful in a climate adaptation context. I think with what we're seeing at the federal level with changes to NEPA policies, guidance, and regulations, just to make sure that, we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater and lose something in trying to get expedited review. So just something to think about at the state level as well.
Thank you both. So Annie, you had mentioned a little bit about, community engagement. We had a number of questions about that. Jessica Sanchez asked if you could speak briefly to negligence. So do you mean government liability for allowing development where it shouldn't be, or simply failing to fix infrastructure repeatedly damaged due to lack of fiscal capability?
Mm-hmm. Annie, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, just really briefly, it's more on that second point. So, failing to fix infrastructure that gets damaged. The negligence section is pretty short, but it briefly covers issues of duty to maintain public roads and how sea level rise and worsening coastal hazards might affect what that looks like in this context, and then where defenses like sovereign immunity might apply. And then, of course, a more affirmative disinvestment strategy would sort of negate these potential claims because that would eliminate the duty to maintain. So it just sort of ties those kinds of considerations in.
Thank you. So we also had a number of questions kind of related to incentives for managed retreat actions. So one was how can infrastructure decisions in a managed retreat context be integrated into the transportation improvement program selection process? Are there good examples?
Yeah, I will try to take this one as well. I am not aware of any specific examples, and I think I saw this question from Rob Graff. I know, Rob, you were on the recent ICNet workshops, and this came up on that as well. I know this is cited too in the infrastructure section. There was an NCHRP report on economic and development implications of disinvestment. The examples and case studies that they go into don't really talk about it in the climate change context, where an agency was actively deciding to disinvest infrastructure because of climate change or sea level rise. But there were some important or interesting points in that. One of the things that it came out with is that they did a survey of states on how they're integrating disinvestment strategies into transportation decision making. And the majority of the survey respondents said that they were doing so through the process of developing a STIP. So I'm not entirely sure what that has exactly looks like. And again, I don't have any examples in this context of sea level rise and managed retreat, but that is available as a resource to the extent that there are opportunities to draw some conclusions from disinvestment decisions in other contexts.
Thank you. I think if you don't mind, we'll just ask one more question. It's about kind of changing from infrastructure a bit here, wetland migration. So Rob Perini asks if you came across any examples of policies, practices for considering future wetland boundaries to buffer areas under wetland regulations or other tools.
So thanks for the question. So I'd suggest you take a look at the wetland migration section and also an article that I put out on this subject, looking at examples of state and local laws and policies and plans that specifically talk about not just wetland migration, but thinking about it in light of climate change. So where wetlands could go. Two quick examples I'll talk about. One great example of a plan looking at sort of where wetlands are, where they could be going, and what we need to do to help them survive when they get somewhere and become established. Blackwater 2100, Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge is in Dorchester County in Maryland, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service worked with nonprofit partners to put together a great plan there, which I suggest you take a look at, and I think could also inform potential legal complements on the ground for areas that surround protected areas. Also in Florida, the municipality of Yankeetown used the tool for overlay zones to put together what they called a natural resource conservation adaptation action overlay. So long name, but it's an overlay district to really think proactively about future development and look at either not citing development in what has been identified for wetland migration or salt forest migration pathways. And if it is cited, to cite it in a way that it could either be removed in the future if it becomes an obstruction to that migration, or look at citing it in a way that's friendly, particularly for wetlands. So could you elevate a home that's higher and allow wetlands to go underneath? That'd be more difficult with forests because they're taller. But there are some other examples in there, including from Maine and some other states and municipalities. So it's, I think, definitely an evolving area, and I look forward to continue tracking it.
Great, thank you so much. I know we're at 1 o'clock. I'm wondering if maybe you actually could take one more question, because we had a ton of questions.
Sure.
Is that fine? Okay, good, thank you. So our next question is from, one more question. Okay, our next question was from about kind of, oh, sorry guys, about the TDR option and whether it typically comes with oversight and consideration for the cumulative effects of increased development in receiving zones. So if this were adopted on a wide scale, could it contribute to local traffic and pollution in the receiving zones without potentially input from the receiving community?
Mm-hmm. So that's an excellent point, and Annie also specializes in regional governance questions, so feel free to chime in. The short answer is it's something that needs to be done more. We're trying to promote comprehensive managed retreat solutions. So how can you think about if you used a TDR program, this would be a part of that comprehensive thinking. It's probably not done as much as it should. But one example that we talk about in the toolkit, King County and Washington State has a nationally recognized example of a TDR program. And one thing that the state has done, it hasn't had much uptake yet, but it's basically the idea that if areas that are receiving areas outside of a jurisdiction, so outside of King County, for example, if they choose to accept development credits from another county, they can get an increased portion of taxes that are already paid, so it's not a tax increase, to fund investments in infrastructure or housing in those areas. So what are ways that by implementing these programs, can state and local jurisdictions support those receiving community investments? Because usually those costs aren't included in the pricing of the sale of those TDR credits, or is this something that could be added on top of that? But then there's also questions about what would need to be done at the local level to increase density or make those different types of investments. So how can you incorporate that for planning and land use and zoning changes? And then the really important key here also is to engage communities in those discussions upfront and throughout these entire processes, so you're not exacerbating or creating new impacts for these places through increased traffic or things like that where people weren't consulted and it's in their own neighborhoods.
So thank you so much, Katie and Annie, for your marvelous presentation. You can tell we have a very educated constituency here in New Jersey who are asking you some fantastic questions, and we thank all of you who have been typing suggestions and information in the chat box. We're going to share all that chat with Annie and Katie, because we're sure they love to hear and learn from everybody as they're going forward. But the toolkit is really very meaty, and I encourage you all to take some time and read it, because I've worked with Georgetown Climate Center and their work is impeccable. And so there'll be lots of information. There's lots of information there. So thank you all on behalf of the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center for participating. Today, we are going to have a copy of this recording posted on our website, hopefully in the next 24 to 48 hours. And your comments have also helped us in helping to target where we're going to take our new center and some of the information people are interested in. So we hope you'll join us for future webinars in this series, which are in the process of being scheduled. And for now, that concludes today's event. So thank you very much.